Does America still have a why? It's a question we don't ask enough, and the consequences of ignoring it are everywhere. A nation doesn't lose its power when it loses resources, influence, or technology. A nation loses its power when it forgets its purpose. When the story that once united millions becomes blurred, weakened, or replaced with noise, people drift. Trust erodes. Cynicism spreads. And the future becomes something we brace for instead of build. But America's story didn't begin with what it had. It began with what it believed. A belief so clear, so compelling, so bold that people crossed oceans, risked everything, and built something the world had never seen before. So the question isn't just, does America have a why? The real question, the urgent question, is do we still remember it, and are we still willing to live by it? Because if we can rediscover that purpose, if we can reconnect to the belief that started it all, then America's greatest days aren't behind us, they're ahead. A nation built on a belief, not a border, begins with understanding that people, especially men, don't rally around lines drawn on a map. They rally around meaning. Men are wired to move towards something that gives them identity, direction, and a sense of responsibility. Women see this too. They watch what men commit to, what men protect, and what men are willing to sacrifice for. Borders don't inspire sacrifice. Beliefs do. And in America's earliest days, the belief that people had the right to live free, to speak boldly, and to pursue possibility wasn't just an idea. It was a call to action that shaped the psychology of the people who built it. When purpose becomes clear, human behavior transforms, especially in men who are naturally driven by mission. Men are built to rise to a role, to carry weight, to defend something larger than themselves. Women often evaluate the strength of a society by observing whether the men in it have something meaningful to stand for. And in America's founding, the belief in individual dignity gave men a challenge worthy of their nature. It didn't give them comfort. It gave them responsibility. That responsibility ignited courage, unity, and loyalty that borders alone could never produce. A belief strong enough to shape a nation becomes a mirror for everyone in it. For men, it reflects who they must become to uphold that belief. For women, it reveals whether those men still honor the values the nation claims to cherish. America's belief in equality and liberty wasn't just political theory. It demanded a level of character, discipline, and integrity that men had to embody. The belief pushed them to grow, pushed them to serve, and pushed them to earn the respect of the women and families who depended on them. A border never asks anything of you. A belief demands everything. Men drift when the mission disappears, and society feels that drift immediately. Women sense when men no longer have something stable and meaningful to devote their energy to. When a nation forgets its belief, men begin filling the void with competition, distraction, or apathy. The energy that once built nations starts to scatter. And the same men who once found identity and purpose begin to feel lost in comfort. Without a belief to aim toward, borders become empty, and the people inside them feel like they're living in someone else's story rather than building their own. A nation's belief becomes the anchor that stabilizes relationships, communities, and generations. Men feel most grounded when they are trusted with a meaningful responsibility. Women feel most secure when that responsibility is upheld with consistency. America's foundational belief created a shared expectation that every person played a role in protecting the values that made life worth building. It wasn't land that created unity. It was a shared narrative of what life could be when freedom and responsibility worked together. The belief shaped how men saw themselves and how women saw the future they could build alongside them. A belief that powerful doesn't just create citizens. It creates protectors, providers, teachers, and leaders. Men respond to belief because it tells them they matter. Women respond to belief because it reassures them that what is being built has a future. And America's why was never about geography. It was about the kind of humans people were willing to become when they were driven by purpose instead of proximity. When purpose fades, division fills the void because human beings, especially men, cannot exist in a vacuum of meaning. Men are wired to seek direction, to know what they are working toward, to feel that their strength, effort, and sacrifice matter. Women watch this closely, often sensing before men do when that purpose begins to erode. When a nation loses its why, men lose the compass that tells them who they are supposed to be within it. And without that internal compass, the energy that once fueled unity begins to break apart into frustration, competition, and blame. When a clear purpose disappears, men instinctively start searching for something else to anchor themselves to. Sometimes they cling to ideology, sometimes to status, sometimes to conflict, because the mind doesn't tolerate emptiness for long. Women feel the ripple effects immediately. Homes feel less stable, relationships feel less grounded, and communities feel tenser. What once was a shared mission becoming a silent struggle as men try to compensate for the loss of meaning by asserting strength in ways that don't build anything. Division grows not because men desire it, but because without purpose, the natural drive to lead and protect has nowhere constructive to go. When people don't know what they're standing for, they start focusing on who they're standing against. Men become more reactive, more defensive, more territorial when they don't feel connected to a larger belief that guides their behavior. Women see this shift and often interpret it as emotional withdrawal or aggression, when in reality, it's the psychology of displacement, strength with no direction, passion with no mission, responsibility with no target. In a nation built on belief, this is dangerous territory because the absence of purpose creates the perfect conditions for fear and resentment to grow. When unity breaks down, it's rarely because people stopped caring, it's because they stopped knowing why they should care. Men need a reason that gives their energy focus. Without it, they start to question their own value, their place in society, and their role in the future. Women sense this uncertainty and often feel compelled to carry emotional weight that was never meant to be carried alone. The imbalance deepens the divide. Men feel inadequate, women feel overwhelmed, and both sides feel disconnected from the shared story that once held them together. When a nation's purpose weakens, the relationships within it weaken too, because purpose is what shapes behavior, sacrifice, and trust. Men show up differently when they feel needed by something bigger than themselves. Their confidence, patience, and sense of duty expand. Women respond to that clarity, feeling safer and more supported. But when purpose fades, men's psychological need for mission gets redirected into protecting their ego rather than protecting their people. What once fueled contribution now fuels confrontation, and the collective spirit that once united a nation splinters into individual battles. When meaning disappears, division becomes the substitute because humans are not built to live without clarity. Men, in particular, cannot thrive without a cause to rise to, a direction to move toward, or a belief to embody. Women cannot thrive when men are operating from confusion instead of conviction. And in a nation that once drew its strength from a shared why, the loss of purpose doesn't just weaken institutions or politics, it weakens the psychological foundation of the very people who are meant to carry it forward. Prosperity without meaning is a slow collapse because comfort can hide decay far longer than struggle ever could. Men, in particular, are vulnerable in times of abundance, not because they lack strength, but because their psychology is built around purpose, not ease. Women notice this drift before it becomes obvious. They see when men start moving through life without direction, when success becomes routine instead of meaningful, and when achievement no longer feels tied to identity. A nation may look prosperous on the outside, but if its men no longer feel necessary on the inside, the decline has already begun. Prosperity becomes dangerous when it replaces purpose instead of supporting it. Men are designed to push towards something, to build, to protect, to strive, and when life becomes too comfortable, that instinct has nowhere to go. Women often interpret this stagnation as disengagement or emotional distance. But at its core, it's a psychological crisis, energy with no mission, drive with no target, strength with no responsibility. And just like individuals, nations begin to decay the moment they forget what all their prosperity was meant to serve in the first place. Prosperity gives people options, but too many options without a guiding belief leads to confusion. Men begin questioning their roles, their significance, and their path forward. Women start feeling the instability created by that uncertainty. What looks like abundance from the outside often becomes anxiety on the inside, a quiet conflict between having more and feeling less. When a nation's why is clear, prosperity becomes fuel for progress. But when the why fades, prosperity becomes a distraction that hides the erosion of unity, character, and direction. Prosperity without meaning tempts men to seek validation instead of contribution. When the mission is unclear, men often latch onto the symbols of success: money, status, recognition, hoping those things will fill the void that a lack of purpose created. Women recognize this pattern because it impacts the emotional climate of families and relationships. The shift from purpose-driven action to ego-driven action creates friction. It creates distance. And it creates a culture where competing replaces contributing. The nation becomes full of individuals who are successful but not fulfilled, wealthy but not grounded, connected online but isolated in spirit. Prosperity becomes hollow when it no longer aligns with a belief that unites people. Men thrive when their work, effort, and sacrifices point to a shared purpose that benefits more than just themselves. Women thrive when they see men living with conviction, clarity, and intention. But when a nation celebrates wealth more than meaning, progress more than principles, and success more than service, the psychology of its people fractures. Men begin to measure themselves by what they accumulate rather than who they become. Women begin to question whether the prosperity around them has any foundation strong enough to last. Prosperity without meaning slowly erodes the resilience of a nation because meaning is what keeps prosperity from corrupting character. Men lose direction when comfort becomes their default state, and women lose trust when men no longer embody the values that once defined a shared future. A nation can survive poverty with purpose, but it cannot survive prosperity without it, because the moment people stop knowing why they're thriving is the moment they stop caring how they're living. The real strength of America isn't power, it's principle, because power can intimidate, but principle can inspire. Men respond to principle far more deeply than they respond to authority. It shapes their identity, their moral compass, and their sense of who they must become. Women notice this instantly. They see the difference between men who operate from strength and men who operate from values. A nation built on principle empowers its men to act with integrity, responsibility, and conviction, and that creates a foundation far stronger than any military or economy ever could. The true measure of a nation is revealed in what its men choose to stand for when no one is watching. Men instinctively look for a code to follow, a standard to rise to, a belief that gives structure to their strength. Women rely on this because a man guided by principle is predictable in the best way, steady, honorable, trustworthy. America's founding belief in liberty, dignity, and equality created that structure. It gave men a North Star that shaped their decisions, their families, and their communities. This is what made the nation strong long before it became powerful. A nation's principles define its culture, and culture dictates how men behave when pressure rises. Men who are grounded in principle don't crumble under stress. They become more focused, more united, more determined. Women draw confidence from that steadiness, knowing the men around them won't compromise the values that keep relationships, families, and societies stable. Power might win battles, but principle wins loyalty, trust, and legacy. And America's greatest influence has always come from its willingness to anchor itself in what is right, not just in what is possible. The psychology of men is deeply tied to purpose, and purpose is deeply tied to principle. When men believe in something that transcends themselves, their capacity expands. They become protectors, not controllers, builders, not critics, leaders, not competitors. Women see this shift clearly. They see how men change when they are driven by conviction instead of fear or ego. America's principles once elevated men into their best selves because they asked them to serve something larger and more enduring than personal success. Principles create accountability, and accountability creates respect. Men thrive when they know what is expected of them, when they understand the values they must uphold, and when their actions are measured against something meaningful. Women respect men whose behavior aligns with their beliefs because it shows consistency and strength of character. A nation built on principle gives its people a shared language of responsibility. It sets rules for how strength should be used, never to dominate, always to elevate. The real power of principle is that it unites people even when they disagree. Men and women don't need to share every opinion to share a belief in honesty, courage, fairness, and responsibility. Those principles create alignment, trust, and direction. America's strength has never been the size of its borders or the weight of its power. It has been the collective commitment of its people to uphold the values that define who they are and how they treat one another. When principle leads, power follows. But when power leads without principle, nations lose themselves long before they lose anything else. If we lose the why, we lose the future, because human beings cannot thrive without understanding what they are moving toward, especially men whose psychology depends on direction, mission, and meaning. Men are not built to wander, they are built to aim. Women feel this truth deeply because they see the impact of a man with purpose and the instability of a man without it. A nation loses more than clarity when its why fades. It loses the very force that drives men to lead, protect, build, and sacrifice. Without purpose, the future becomes something people fear instead of something they shape. When the why disappears, men start replacing it with substitutes that cannot sustain them. They chase distractions, cling to status, or immerse themselves in competition because the mind refuses to sit still when meaning is missing. Women watch this shift and often interpret it as emotional distance or unpredictability, but at its core, it's a response to purposelessness. A man without a why is a man whose strength has no channel, whose drive has no direction, and whose identity has no anchor. And a nation full of men in this state slowly loses the ability to move forward with unity or vision. When the why weakens, the next generation inherits confusion instead of conviction. Men set the tone for the future, not just with their actions, but with the beliefs they embody. Women rely on this transmission of values because it shapes the emotional and moral environment that children grow up in. Without a clear why, men cannot offer guidance that feels rooted or consistent, and women cannot build stability on a foundation that shifts with every cultural trend. A nation's future is built in the minds of the young, but it is protected in the purpose of the adults. When that purpose fades, the future becomes vulnerable. When people don't know why they're working, they stop caring how well they work. Men lose pride in their effort, and women lose confidence in their leadership. Families feel less unified, communities feel less connected, and society feels less coherent. A nation without a why becomes a collection of individuals instead of a collective identity. Men who once felt part of a mission now feel isolated. Women who once trusted the direction of the culture now question its trajectory. The erosion is subtle at first, but unmistakable once it begins. When the why is forgotten, progress becomes hollow because it lacks the moral and emotional fuel that gives achievement meaning. Men may still succeed, but the success doesn't satisfy. Women may still support, but the support doesn't feel reciprocated. The future becomes a chase instead of a calling. A nation that once built with intention begins merely to consume, and the energy that once shaped destiny gets spent on short-term wins instead of long-term purpose. When the why is lost, the future drifts because direction cannot come from prosperity, politics, or power. It can only come from belief. Men thrive when they are guided by a mission that calls them forward, and women thrive when they feel that mission is grounded, stable, and authentic. Without the why, the future becomes a guessing game instead of a guided journey. The nation stops creating its future and starts reacting to it, one uncertain step at a time. Reclaiming the story that once united millions begins with understanding that human beings anchor their identity in narrative, not in noise. Men, especially, need a story that tells them who they are, what they stand for, and what their role is in shaping the future. Women see the impact of this more intimately than anyone else. They watch men rise when the story is clear and drift when the story is fractured. A nation's story is not entertainment, it is psychological architecture. When the story becomes blurred, the people within it become uncertain, and unity dissolves not from conflict, but from confusion. When a nation forgets its story, men lose the script that once guided their behavior, their responsibility, and their vision for what they could become. Men need a challenge woven into the narrative, something that pushes them to grow and gives their strength purpose. Women rely on this sense of direction because it shapes the emotional climate of homes, relationships, and communities. Without a shared story, men struggle to see their place, and women struggle to trust the path ahead. A country doesn't fall apart because it lacks resources. It falls apart when it lacks a narrative strong enough to hold its people together. When the story weakens, people start writing their own isolated versions, each one disconnected from the others. Men begin to define themselves by temporary roles, temporary victories, and temporary identities. Women feel the fragmentation in the way men communicate, commit, and carry themselves. What once was a shared belief becoming a collection of personal agendas. And without a unifying story, disagreements turn into divisions, differences turn into battles, and the nation's psychological cohesion starts to crack. When a united story exists, men channel their energy into contribution rather than competition. A powerful story gives them a direction to move toward, not just an opponent to resist. Women feel safer and more grounded when the men around them are guided by a narrative that reinforces values like responsibility, integrity, and courage. The story doesn't just unite millions, it organizes the emotional and moral structure of society. It shapes how people treat each other, how they make decisions, and how they view their place in the world. When a nation's story is reclaimed, it reconnects people not only to their past, but to their purpose. Men rediscover the belief that their actions matter, that their role is vital, and that their character contributes to something enduring. Women rediscover confidence in the culture around them, trusting that the men they depend on are anchored in values that have stood the test of time. The story becomes a reminder of who people are and why they belong, creating a shared identity that transcends individual struggle. When millions unite around a story, it becomes a moral engine that drives everything forward. Men operate with greater intention because they are part of something larger than themselves. Women feel more supported because the story provides stability and clarity in a world full of shifting narratives. Reclaiming that story is not about nostalgia. It's about realigning a nation with the belief that once called people into their best selves, reminded them of their shared destiny, and gave meaning to the sacrifices required to build something lasting.